Okay, guys. So I'm going to walk you through, or attempt to walk you through, how to approach a leaking airway. Okay, so I apologize. I'm going to be kneeling for most of this. I'm trying to do this in my basement rather than a hospital bed. Okay, which wouldn't be a realistic problem or anything like that. So when you think about our patients with an artificial airway, they're going to be on the ventilator most of the time, right? So you would typically get a call that there's an alarm going on the ventilator, and or the patient is having a desaturation event. So anytime something significant's going on for a patient with an artificial airway, our first goal is to ensure that they're being ventilated. Okay, so whenever you enter the room, we're going to have the kind of mindset of evaluating the situation as quick as possible. So that includes glancing at vital signs, looking at your patient, looking at the alarms from the ventilator, and they're going to try and clue you in. But if there's any concern as to if that patient is being appropriately ventilated, our goal is going to be to provide manual ventilation. So every patient with an artificial airway should have an ambu bag in their room. They should be hooked up to a flow meter and ready to go at a moment's notice. Okay, so a lot of times you still might need the mask if they lose their airway. So sometimes leave that on the back of the ventilator. Sometimes it'll be attached. Okay, so let's say I get a call for this patient. They're having a low tidal volume alarm, maybe a low minute ventilation alarm. Kind of sound like a loud gurgling on their breathing and everything, and poor saturation. So the first thing that comes to mind is possibility of an underinflated cuff, blown cuff, something like that, a leaky pilot line or something. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and we'd have our airway secured a little bit better. We're going to go ahead, begin by applying manual ventilation. Okay, so as I'm pushing these breaths in, okay, not only am I going to be assessing the changes in vital signs, but I'm going to be looking at my patient. So if you notice here, I'm squeezing the bag. I'm not having to squeeze really hard, which tells me a lot, right? So it's not like I have a mucus plug or a kink tube or anything like that. I'm looking at the patient. I don't have any chest rise. So on a real patient, you'd probably have like a leaky sound or loud gurgling noise. And it's hard to describe, but as soon as you hear it, you'll know exactly what it is. And you'll hear air coming out during inspiration, all right, whether that's a bag from the ventilator or a breath from my ambu bag or anything like that. You'll hear that loud leak. Okay, so leaks can happen for a bunch of different reasons. All right, so the first thing we try and assume, treat the most obvious thing, possibly just cuff needs reinflated. Sometimes these things might have a slow leak, maybe the tube's a little bit positional, maybe swelling's going down or something like that, or quite possibly the pressures are up on the ventilator and just making it a little bit more noticeable. So you're going to go ahead and you're going to draw back on your 10cc syringe. I always usually leave one of these in my patient's room on the back of the ventilator as well. We're going to hook up, and then while you're giving a breath, you can use a stethoscope if you wanted to, okay, and listen to the side of the neck. I'm going to keep advancing that air until I don't hear the leak. So you notice I put a significant amount of air in, still no chest rise, still hearing the leak. Okay, so at this point, we would know that'd be a bad situation, but let me kind of tell you the different things that can cause this problem. So with the leaky cuff, if it doesn't respond to that initial inflation, okay, there's a few things that could be going wrong. First and foremost, the worst, blown cuff, whether that had a tiny little tear, whether something happened, cuffs blow or can end up separating, okay? And that's a problem because there's no way to fix that, unfortunately, okay? Other things it could be a nick in the pilot balloon. Okay, sometimes patients will bite on their ET tube, and we put a bite block on that tube, and we do the patient an injustice by not running the pilot line through it. So what happens now? You're giving the patient a hard surface to grind their teeth on top of this pilot line, and it's very easy to get a nick. I've had people nick these during shaving patients and all sorts of stuff. So a lot of things can happen. So it could be a nick pilot line. Sometimes it's extremely hard to find. Okay, sometimes we can get lucky and see it, or we can make a guess as to where it's, if that's the problem or something like that, but that could be a problem. The other thing, and this one's the easiest fix, is a poor spring on your pilot balloon, okay? And sometimes these go bad. Sometimes they're bad from the get-go, and that's, I think I told you when I'm checking my ET tubes, I'll inflate it, make sure the cuff holds, remove the syringe, and then hook back and deflate, okay? Just because I've had ET tubes where that little spring goes bad here. So it's tough. How do you know what's what? Okay, so we know that by placing air inside of the cuff there, it did not fix our leak. We didn't have a problem. There'd be a lot of other stuff going on right here, right now. I'd be manually ventilating, not talking you guys through all this stuff. So let me show you something that kind of works for me, okay? And I've kind of found. So this is an ET tube. Nothing wrong with this one or anything like that. So what I want to show you is as I put air in, okay, come to you a little bit closer. As I put air in, that cuff should inflate. And watch. We know that there's problems with putting too much air in for long term. But whenever I come up and assess the situation, first off, I want to know, okay, did that patient's leak stop? Not only if that leak stops do I know the cuff's okay, but if I see something like this, hang on, I overinflate that cuff just slowly, all right? And then what you would see is there's so much pressure that builds in that cuff, it should have enough force to push that syringe back right there, okay? So that tells me that when I'm applying volume or air into this pilot balloon or this pilot line in that cuff, if that happens, and be careful, you don't want to pop it, okay? That means that the system is sealed while that syringe is on there. So in those cases, I know if I do this, my cuff inflates and my leak goes away, maybe I fixed the problem. But this tells me that I do not probably have a rupture in my cuff. And if I do, it's a very, very small one. But the most likely cause is that there's not a rupture on that thing. Okay, and then I would properly inflate that, usually minimal occlusion volume or cufflator or anything. Let's say I hook that up. I push my syringe. Nothing happens. Okay, I add air. I don't meet any resistance. My leak doesn't go away. I either got a hole in my cuff. Something's wrong with my pilot line. I know my pilot balloon is probably not the culprit there. Okay, because if the pilot balloon is the only culprit, everything will seem fine. When you inflate that, it'll push that syringe back and everything. But then when you take the syringe away, it goes bad. All right. So I use that little trick, and that allows me to quickly tell if that cuff has its integrity or not. So in this case here, when I try and add air, nothing happens. Okay. I don't get any resolution to my symptoms or anything like that. My syringe doesn't get pushed back by the resistance. So I know I got a leak somewhere, probably the pilot line or the pilot balloon. So this is where things get a little bit dicey, okay? There's no way to 100% be able to tell, but if you think you have a little bit of a rupture, you can use this pilot line repair kit. So if you think you got a little bit of a micro tear or something like that in the pilot balloon, all right, in the spot right around the mouth, we can take a pair of scissors, we can snip this, and then this piece actually slides right back down in the pilot balloon. And now I left my scissors out of view here. Otherwise, I would snip this thing and kind of show you. All right. So with that being said, you want to be careful about snipping this, and you need to be ready to put it in. So I usually grab a pair of hemostats or Kelly clamps, grab that thing, make sure when I cut it, I'm ready to thread this piece in, and then I use those Kellys to kind of help me slide this piece inside of the pilot line. This becomes your new pilot balloon. So this repair technique would work if you thought the problem was with your pilot balloon, or you thought you had a bite mark or something like that. Sometimes if I'm not sure, I'll give it a last-ditch effort and see if it resolves things. So let's say I change this out, still leaking, my patient's doing very, very poor, okay? We need to exchange that thing. So when you think about what happens, if we pull this ET tube, we got to completely re-intubate this patient. We may never get that tube back in. It's really tough to hyperoxygenate some of these people. Some patients do fine with 100% from the ventilator, but the fact that we can't maintain that PEEP and we're not effectively ventilating these patients, we can run into problems. Anytime we remove that airway, we're worried that we may not get it back in, and something bad could happen. We know that we're in the trachea here right now, okay? So what we could do, if we know we're in the trachea, instead of having to go through the process of completely re-intubating them, we can use a tube exchanger or a bougie, all right? We can lay this as a guide wire, pull the old ET tube out, put a new one down without actually having to, I mean, some doctors still scope them, but we know that we have something residing in the trachea, and we don't have to worry about having as much trouble getting that thing back in. So you would need a second set of hands here, obviously. We get another ET tube checked, lubed, ready to go. And you want to put a good amount of lubricant on this thing, all right? I'm going to go ahead, draw that syringe back, and leave it on there. Okay, I would have a partner having this one. And what we do, when everybody's ready, and a lot of times we still will drug these patients and sedate and repairalize them, so we're not messing with a bunch of stuff. All right, there's usually units of measurement marked on this bougie, and that way we know we're not harpooning the carina or something. Mine is pretty worn down, so as you can see, I got a black mark that denotes the end of an ET tube. Our goal is not to really go off the end of the ET tube in these cases, but just to lay it as a, just to really keep it as a guide wire, so to speak. Okay, so I'm going to use the end that's kind of curved there. That's going to be the end that I'm sticking in. So what we would do, I would slowly advance this. All right, and the cuff is blown. If you weren't really sure, you could still have somebody deflate this cuff down, but you can squeeze that pilot balloon and tell there's a big rupture on this thing. So I'm going to go right until I'm at the end of the tube. In real cases, you could look at the unit of measurements right there on the side and line up, 29 and 29 or whatever. All right. So at this point, this is where it gets tricky. You need to keep this thing in place. All right. You don't want to advance it too far and jab the carina because it could cause them to brady down and cause a lot of other problems. All right. Likewise, we don't want to come out too high. Otherwise, we might lose that guide wire and need to be able to re-intubate these patients fully. We still need to be prepared for that and have our airway cart and everything, but hopefully all we're going to do is pull this tube out and put a new one in. So usually you'll have somebody hold this kind of firmly and keep that in place while you're trying to pull this tube out, okay? And we're just slowly kind of sliding this thing up and out. All right, this is where it gets tough there. Somebody's having to hold it in. Okay, the properly lubed and checked tube will be slid down. And then all we're trying to do is slide this back to where that tube kind of resided before. Okay, so somebody's holding this really, really well. I should have lubed this thing up a little bit better. Don't have any lubricant here at the house. Okay, I'm about 21. I don't know if that thing slid in or not just because it's getting hung up. Go ahead, hold the bougie, hook up. Got chest rise. Now, with this case, I usually will, I got a little bit of an air leak here. I don't think I'm really deep down in that patient's trachea. All right, sometimes I still usually will check CO2, so put a colorimetric adapter on there, okay? But we should see, all right, we're 21 at the teeth, just like the old one. We exchange that tube. Now we can properly ventilate this patient, all right, and oxygenate them, and we could resume previous ventilation, all right? We hook them back up to the ventilator or whatever. Usually at this point, you could trash this thing, but what I like to do is I do always want to know kind of where the leak is and see if it was something where they nicked the pilot balloon or pilot line and I missed it, or if it was indeed a cuff rupture. And usually you can't tell because air is not visible, but if you put this in a little basin with water, all right, draw some air back, hook it up to the pilot balloon, lay it in water and push through, you'll see bubbles from wherever the rupture is. And in this case, you got a little bit of a micro tear on our cuff. Okay, sometimes it's a little tear in the pilot line. Sometimes it's just a tiny little separation up here. So I'm always curious to check it in water, but you don't necessarily have to. So that's using a bougie to exchange an ET tube. They do make some other tube exchangers that are not as rigid and stuff like that. The bougie really is for intubation and everything as well. All right, but it's a very versatile tool, and it's an essential part of every difficult airway cart. Okay, so once again, we would have had all the different supplies necessary for intubation. But essentially, hopefully, with using the bougie, we're just really having to exchange that ET tube with some lube and then check with CO2, and then that should be it. Okay, so much safer under most circumstances rather than pulling the ET tube out, trying to manually ventilate these patients and trying to re-establish an airway through RSI. So hope that helps. That's something you can play with a little bit more in lab. I'll have a couple more coming your way here in a little bit.